Hello and welcome to my podcast, Whisper in the Shadows, the true story of a real-life undercover cop. I'm Michael Bates, and I was a police officer for 15 years in one of the country's state police forces. I was also an undercover cop for over 2 years, and all the episodes of this podcast are my true stories of what it's really like to be an undercover cop. Rather, I was Michael Bates. So, full disclosure, Michael is not actually my real name. It was my covert identity I used on most of my operations. Now, everyone has a notion of what undercover policing is all about. Whether you think they are a narc, a covert operative, a dog, or an undercover cop, most people seem to confuse plainclothes police with being undercover. There is a very big difference though. Most plainclothes police don't wear a uniform, so they aren't as obtrusive in public. Being covert is completely different though. You become immersed in the world of your targets. When you're a police officer, part of your role is to investigate crimes. This means you try and find evidence to prove the person you have arrested has committed that crime. Now, this evidence can consist of physical, verbal, video, and witnesses. When you're an undercover police officer though, you are the evidence, and you are the reason someone gets convicted of the crimes. That is both exciting and dangerous. So, why don't we get on with the next episode? Welcome to episode 9 of our podcast, Whisper in the Shadows. At the end of last week's episode, I had just completed my first operation, got married, and been on a honeymoon for 2 weeks. And as I said then, came back ready to start my next operation. Well, it didn't quite work like that. You see, there is an awful lot of paperwork that needs to be done to make sure that all of the briefs were ready to go for prosecution of the various charges. Whilst I would love for it to have been action all the time, clandestine meetings, buying drugs or buying stolen property, it wasn't. I would say that about 60% of your time is spent doing administrative stuff, whether that's writing notes contemporaneously through to ensuring tapes were transcribed and statements were written. The notes were usually done during the operation so as to ensure that the details were as accurate as possible. But after the op closed, I would have to write numerous statements and also transcribe lots of tapes. That is the hardest part. It typically took me 3 times the length of the conversation in time to transcribe. So if a conversation was 30 minutes long, it would take me about an hour and a half. I am no touch typist. I am very much a 2-finger typist. When I went through the police academy, we did typing lessons on electric typewriters and sometimes even mechanical typewriters. There were no computers in those days, which was only the beginning of the 1990s. I think I got to use my first computer in 1993, but all the paperwork was done in multiple copied typewritten reports. It was a laborious task, especially if you forgot to turn one of the carbon copies around. That would mean you would have to start all over again. It was something as a young copper you were always making sure you didn't do, but you always did at least once a week. Speaking of being a young copper, I thought this might be a good place to talk about how and why I became one. In the first episode, I discussed how I became an undercover cop, but I think the story of how I became an actual cop possibly lends itself to why I gravitated towards being a UC. You see, becoming a copper was never on my radar, ever, until it happened. I grew up wanting to be an actor. I was good at school sport, but I excelled in drama in school. I was always in the school musical from about grade 9, as well as the School of Stedfords or School Spectacular as they became known. And although I couldn't sing, we always did one that had at least one major speaking role, which was mine. I was very theatrical, which doesn't mean gay, just a very good actor. So, NIDA and acting was my goal. I went to uni and started a double degree in psychology and drama. I applied to NIDA, did the initial audition, but didn't go back for the second. I got into another university's drama program, but again, didn't end up enrolling and stay where I grew up. I did pantos as a kid and I tried my hand at local theatre and also theatre sports, which was very big in the late 80s and early 90s. Think whose line is it anyway? So, I'm at uni, having an absolute ball, doing okay in psychology, doing good in drama, but not doing that well overall. Okay, maybe Russian I did okay in, but my GPA was below 4, which meant I was in the exclusion zone. At the same time, I was living in a house with 6 housemates. Yes, there were 7 of us, 6 females and me. One of the housemates' friends from school had been a copper and he was often around at our house. He would talk about how much fun he was having as a copper and generally telling stories of the things that had happened. I remember saying to him he must have rocks in his head. Again, it's important to note that this was just after the huge Royal Commission in Queensland, which had a lot of media coverage across the country from the late 80s and into the early 90s. Anyway, I'm studying my drama hoping to be an actor. The last semester of 1990, I failed a number of subjects. Now, I put that down to the fact that my days consisted of waking up at 12 midday, watching The Bold and the Beautiful and then another US soap opera, maybe going to uni for a class, but more likely for a social event at the rec club. Then it would be out to a bar unless it was a Thursday night when I had to work. That meant I was officially excluded from that semester. So what did I do? Continued to party as I did before I got excluded, work a few more shifts at Coles, and generally had a good time. But you see, my mum had just completed her law degree and master's degree and was rather upset that I was squandering my talents and opportunity of a university education. I moved home and some soul searching was undertaken, along with a promise to go back to university the following year and knuckle down. I got a full-time job making sales booking calls for office equipment, which was not fun. I remember one Saturday I was with my friend who was a copper, and for some reason he had to go out to the police academy and I went with him. I think maybe I was driving him. You see, he was as blind as a bat but refused to wear glasses. He often joked that it was okay because if he ever had to use his gun, he knew not to shoot anyone wearing blue. So, we are at the academy and we find ourselves in the hall gym. I remember looking up at the police emblem on the wall and saying to him, "Mate, there is no way on God's sweet earth you would ever get me doing this." That was October 1990. In about November, I was up late watching TV because that is what my life consisted of, working during the week, staying up late watching dreadful late night TV, trying to fall asleep, and going out on Friday and Saturday nights, drinking and having a ball of a time. This particular night, an infomercial came on and it was by the police. It basically said, "Join the police, apply now." There was something inside me that went, "Do it, it's the right thing to do." It was a gut feeling. It is very hard to explain to an interviewer that you joined the police not because you always wanted to be a copper, but because you were watching late night TV, an advert came on and you had a gut feeling that it felt like the right thing to do. They actually sniggered a little bit when I said it. But I was accepted and started in January 1991. On that first day, I was sitting in the hall gym at the police academy, listening to the police commissioner welcome us to the academy and the police for a fulfilling career. I absolutely looked up and saw the police emblem directly above the commissioner's head. It then struck me that I was virtually in the same spot as I had been in October the year before, with no chance on God's sweet earth. I did 3 years general duties as a uniform copper before that fateful night out. As a GD, you tend to do a bit of everything. As a probationary, you worked across a lot of different areas like traffic, CIB, juvenile crime, prosecutions, and some even got to go to the water police or other specialist branches. I do have to say that after 4 weeks in the traffic branch, I hardly wrote many more tickets and decided I did not want to do that for a full-time job. The one thing I did get to do was my fair share of drug raids. Now, back in those days, getting a search warrant was not as hard as it probably is now. People were a lot more open about drugs, so information was a lot easier to come by. Also, in most states, you only needed a JP to sign a warrant, rather than a magistrate. If you had enough evidence, you could generally get a search warrant and raid the house there and then. I remember my very first drug raid. There was the local drug squad, 2 uniformed cars, and the dog squad. Now, I had never actually seen any hard drugs. I knew what dope was, also knew how to tell the difference between dope and oregano. But ease or speed, or even heroin or coke, I had no idea about. This particular raid was on an alleged speed dealer's house. It was a high-set square thing with steps up to the front veranda and a long set of steps to the back door at the back. My job was to go to the back corner of the house and make sure 1, no one did a run out the back door, and 2, make sure if anyone threw stuff out the window, it was collected. So here I am, standing at the back corner of this house with a window on the side about a metre or 2 ahead of me. I hear the knock on the front door, the dog barking, and all hell breaking loose upstairs. At the same time, I see an arm shoot out the window with half a head that was looking intently in the direction of the front door. I'm standing there and as a reflex put my hands out, cut together as if I was going to catch a skied cricket ball in the outfield. Old mate sticks his head out, looks down with a look of horror on his face. Quick as a flash, I yell up at him. "Happy to catch that for you, mate, but pretty sure you won't be getting it back." "Fuck off," was the profound reply, and he pulled his arm in and started off towards the back door. So, I raced up the back stairs to the back door and attempted to open it. Now here is where it all got a bit Keystone Cops. The door wouldn't open. There was yelling going on just the other side of it. I had a voice inside my head saying, "You need to get in there." I had watched far too many police movies by that stage, and I decided I would kick the door in. I'm holding both handrails, I lift my right boot and kick out toward the door. I missed it completely and put my foot through the thin panel and actually got it stuck. I remember the door opening, the police dog running out to me, sniffing it, and then back inside. The dog squad officer looking at me grinning and saying, "You might want to get that unstuck." Now the dog did a brilliant job, and there was a large amount of speed found in the bottom of the air conditioner air cooler, which on a hot night wasn't running. Dead giveaway. The next drug raid I went to wasn't as full on as that. In fact, we didn't even have a warrant. A call had come in and a neighbour had complained that their next door neighbour had a marijuana plant growing in between his banana plants in the backyard near their fence line. We were tasked with going around to see if we could go into the neighbour's yard, see the plants, and then use discretionary powers to enter the house and search. Of course, the neighbour didn't want to be involved, which they should have thought of before they actually called the police to report a potential drug crop. I had the bright idea of going to the house, knocking on the door and seeing if we could get in that way. My partner and I go up to the front door of this house and I knock. A young fellow who would have been maybe 20, 21 comes to the door. I make the usual greeting, who I am, where I'm from, and that we were making an inquiry. Without a word of a lie, he then says, "I guess you're here for the dope plants." Yeah mate, can you take us to them? I said. "Yeah, follow me," he said. So we follow him through the house and out into the backyard. Now the report had been a few plants in between his banana plants in the backyard. I was expecting to see 3 or 4 tall banana plants, and then in between them 1 or 2 marijuana plants. I was expecting the marijuana to be 2 or 3 foot high. What we found was the complete opposite. There were 4 banana plants alright, but they were only about 2 foot high. In between them were 3 by 7 foot marijuana plants that were extremely bushy. They were huge. It was an incredible sight. "Mate, what are they?" I asked. He replied, "Marijuana plants." I gave him a warning about not having to say anything, etc, etc. He was happy to talk to us. I think he felt a sense of relief at getting caught and being able to unburden himself. It appears he had bought a few seeds 18 months earlier and one day decided to throw them out in the banana trees. Now, where we were living at the time, there was a lot of rain, so the plants started to grow. He was a bit of a smoker, so he decided to start cultivating them and thought he would have his own dope supply. The plants got huge, and he then had to put too much labour into to keep them going and harvesting the dope. Because of all the effort he was putting into the marijuana, the banana plants started not to grow, and we were where we were when we arrived. "I guess you want to see the dope I've already got as well," he then said. Yeah mate, sure," I said. So he takes us into his bedroom. He had one of those old 6-drawer standing drawer tall boys, but an old one that had like metre wide drawers that would have been 50 centimetres long and 20 centimetres deep. He opened the second bottom drawer, and this was chock-a-block full of dried green leafy material. It was a lot. He claimed it was for his own personal use. We took it all back to the station, interviewed him, and he was charged with possession and cultivation. See, drugs are bad. But I think the best drug raid I ever went on was after my stint as undercover cop. I had a much better appreciation of drugs, how they were stored, and how they were dealt or sold. I was working in the local flying squad. I got a call one day from a concerned community member who had seen a lot of vehicles coming and going at all hours from a house in their street. I went to visit this concerned citizen, and during the conversation he produced a foolscap pad with a list of cars' registrations, times and dates. These were the cars that had been dropping into the house in question. Now, we aren't talking about 1 or 2 every couple of hours. We're talking 10 to 15 every hour at all times of the day and night. It was plainly obvious they were selling something from that house. Like a good copper, I took that information back to the station and started doing research on the registrations, or as we call it, investigations. Most came from the local area or within the local police region. Some of the registered owners had criminal histories. There were the typical stealing, property and stolen car varieties, but a large number also had drug possession charges as well. I also did a utility search and found out that the house was in fact using double the local area average power usage. Put all of this together and you came up with hydroponic growing and dealing from the house. I took this to my sergeant, an operation was put together, and we got a search warrant. On the morning of the raid, I went to the front door of the house and knocked. A guy opened it. "Yeah?" "Mate, it's Mick. Jono said if I needed to get some dope, I could come get from you," I said. "Who's Jono, mate?" was his reply. Now the door was open, which was what we wanted. I pulled my badge and said, "Doesn't matter, this house is being raided," and in we all piled. Now the setup was pretty good. They had a hydroponic garden set up in one of the bedrooms with about 40 plants. In another room, they had loose green leafy material and also clipsal bags of GLM. It was in the cupboard that was even more of a find. There were shoe boxes, about 10 of them, and in each lid they had been punched a series of holes. In each of these holes were tubes of a dark brownish sticky liquid, which was later found to be hash oil. They were a one-stop shop for marijuana products. With 2 unmarked police cars out the front of the house, a paddy wagon and another marked car just down the road, if you were a customer, you would probably have second thoughts about going there to buy drugs that morning, right? Well, you would think so, but no, not on this day. I reckon we answered the door to at least 10 customers that morning whilst we were there. We managed to clean up a few warrants and wanted for questionings as well. That whole operation took about 18 hours to finalise, from the raid through to the final lodging of prisoners at the watch house and lodging of exhibits. It was a very good day, especially for the overtime. Drugs were becoming more prevalent and more of an issue. They were becoming more and more out in the open in general society, and even though I was a copper, I was still given the opportunity to be offered them when I was out being social, a la my first drug buy experience. My gut feeling had served me well up until that point. Police often get called all sorts of names in that they profile different groups or use stereotypes. Now, this is all true, but not for the reasons that people automatically assume, i.e., they are all racist pricks. The job of a police officer is to stop crime in the community. Now, that is not an easy thing to do before it happens. Criminals tend to not advertise that they are criminals or that they are about to commit a crime. Well, not the good ones. The dumb ones, sure, but they aren't the only ones that don't get caught. So, a copper's job is not a simple one. You have to use your experiences to look for something that is out of place, something that is against the stereotype that you see and use as a reference point. That means that if you are outside of that reference point, you will have more police interaction. Criminals know this and use this to their advantage, but mostly a copper's gut feeling is telling them that something is out of the norm or is not right. 9 times out of 10, they are usually right. It's not an easy job, and there is no super being like in the Minority Report. So put fate, a gut feeling, and a love of acting together, and what did you get? Me becoming an undercover police officer. You could almost say I had trained for it. Many wouldn't, but I do. So, back to the mountains of paperwork after an operation. I needed to write a statement for every single target there was. Again, this took hours upon hours to do. With all the transcribing added to that, it was a good month or 2 of downtime. Needless to say, I was itching to get back to doing the fun part of the job. There was also the ever-present requirements of possible court after my cell job. The one sure thing with courts was that you could never be sure when you would be needed. And then my next operation came along. Well, it was my next. There had been an operation that I was slated to go on. It had been approved by the committee, and it was in a regional area that Intel suggested was very much a hive of drug activity. There had been a very public incident involving drugs and police in the preceding year. The fact that there had not been any work done there previously was perplexing to many in the job. I and another operative were briefed on this operation. It was that big that they had decided to put 2 of us together into the area. A controller was assigned and plans had been started. Then, out of the blue one day, we get called into the squad's safe house and told the operation is off. No reason given, told there were another couple approved, 1 for each of us, and sent home. I was told later that the decision to not go ahead with the operation, after being approved by the committee, was made by one very senior police officer. There had been a lot of speculation over this officer given their prominence in the previous era of the police force, and this decision for me proved that it was very much on the money. There were rumours and insinuations, but this for me was more than enough proof. A week or so later, a new operation was greenlit, and myself and my new controller met up. He gave me a rundown of the informant, the information, and some of the identified targets. Now, this was always going to be a tricky operation for me. I grew up and lived for a good portion of my life up until enjoying the police in that area. I went to school with not only 2 of the proposed targets, but also the informant, Susan. In fact, I had been a prefect at this school in Year 12. Every morning and every afternoon for a full school year, part of my job was to ensure that everyone was wearing the correct uniform in the morning and the correct uniform home, i.e. make sure they were wearing their berets or boaters, had their ties on, had their socks pulled up, if they were boys, and if they were girls, were wearing the right coloured tights. Every morning and every afternoon for a full year, Susan came through my gate. Every day, she was wearing the wrong coloured tights in the morning, which I would jip her about, and every afternoon she will walk out the gate not wearing her beret, which again I would jip her about. Still, despite all the attention and the fact that she would have had to have known I would jip her, she still came through my gate every single day. Now, I was in my early 20s when I was doing this job, which meant it was inside 10 years since I had been at school. What was worse is that she was in my brother's grade as well, so it was not like she was much younger than I was. My controller and I discussed this, and it was decided to see if Susan recognised me before we nixed the whole operation. Susan was a prostitute and sometimes stripper. She mainly worked freelance but had shacked up with a much older guy, think sugar daddy before it was a thing. And when I say sugar daddy, he lived in a caravan in a dodgy van park on the outskirts of the outer suburbs of the city. Now, this van park was dodgy back in those days. It isn't really much better today, if I'm being honest. My controller and I drove out there in his car and parked in the visitor parking. It was a bit of a walk to the caravan and also took a bit of finding. We eventually found the right van, knocked on the door, and the boyfriend opened it. Now, this place was an absolute mess. There was stuff all over the place. Clothes, boxes, cooking utensils, you name it, and it was probably in there. He was definitely no sugar daddy. I guess he had been a John, had grown attached, and wanted a young and easily influenced girlfriend. I think genuinely he wanted her to get out of the life, but I think it was more for his benefit than it was for hers. She glassily looked over at me as I came in and sat down. She had been quite an attractive young woman when I knew her, and whilst she wasn't ugly by any standard, the years since school, the turning of tricks, but mostly the drugs, had had their effect on her. "This is Michael, Susan," I heard my controller say. She puts out her hand to shake mine. "Hello," she says. There was not even a flicker of recognition of me as anyone other than Michael Bates. There was no, "I know you," or "You look familiar," or "You look like someone I know." There was zip, nada, nothing. Look, to be truthful, I wasn't that concerned. I didn't think she would recognise me given me she was too drug adult. It was agreed we would keep going, but if she did start to twig, then we would shut the operation down straight away. If she did twig, it could put both of us in danger. And so started my next operation. Now, I had to get a safe house, and I was pretty sure I wasn't going to be allowed the cost or the opulence of my last one. It also had to have some pretty rigorous security checks given the previous events. Two of the other UCs had got apartments in the same block in an inner city suburb. The apartment block was the type of place you would expect a drug dealer to be living. The building itself had 9 apartments. It was built in that horrid red brick of the 60s and 70s and had 3 stories with 3 apartments on each level. Of course, I had to get the top floor apartment, didn't I, with 3 flights of very rickety stairs. The block had 2 street frontage, which meant car parking was from the street at the back. There was one of those fibro multi-car carports and a very depressing laundry. In the mid-2000s, someone decided to gentrify them and spent money on refurbishing them. They doubled the rent and a bunch of inner city hipster types moved into them. Okay, unfortunately we have run out of time on this episode. Make sure you join me next week to find out just how I went about starting my next operation and meeting my 2 new targets. Thank you for listening to Whisper in the Shadows, my true stories of a real-life undercover cop. I hope you've enjoyed that episode. In the next one, we'll explore more exciting stories from my operations. Please make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Lastly, if you're an ex-covert operative or undercover police officer, I would love to chat to you about your experiences. Or if you're feeling dangerous, tell your stories on my podcast. Please get in contact by my email, which is whisperintheshadowspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to you joining me next time.